I can't stop myself from gushing about 62 for too long, so, how about another overlooked writer's analysis? And, this time it's an obscure boyo. Ian Stuart Black. Ian Stuart Black wrote 3 scripts for the classic run of Doctor Who, spanning the eras of 2 different Doctors. The first one, The Savages, was broadcast as the penultimate story of Season 3, back-to-back with Black's second offering, The War Machines. Both of these installments airing in 1966 among the waning adventures of William Hartnell's first Doctor. Black's third and final contribution to the show was 1967's The Macra Terror, arranged as the 7th story in the show's 4th season, starring Patrick Troughton in his early days as the second Doctor. All 3 of these scripts were developed under Innes Lloyd's producership. Now, when examining Ian Stuart Black's output for Doctor Who, 2 common traits reveal themselves, particularly relating to our companion characters, as well as the tone that the stories take. Shall I elaborate on this? Firstly, all 3 of these stories share the common theme of the threat psychologically affecting its victims, and this includes our protagonists on all occasions. Let's focus on the Macra Terror to start off with, where the titular crab-like creatures infiltrate and brainwash a human colony into total unquestioning obedience for their own parasitic gain, to the point where any objection or even any suggestion that something is amiss within the society is met with hostility and forced reintegration. The colony itself seems very idealistic and cheery on the surface, but the forced happy-to-obey moods and rhetoric of the pilot and his cohorts really gets under the Doctor's skin, especially when the Macra push to indoctrinate his own companions into serving them. It's a very unnerving premise, as on one hand you agree with the Doctor that something is certainly amiss here and that it must be uncovered and stopped, but on the other hand, the colony's so immersive in its eerily welcoming and pleasant presence that you almost feel like you want to partake in their activities anyway. And that's how you know you've got some phenomenally twisted psychological horror right there, when it actively makes you second guess your own willpower. Already, Black has proved himself to be incredible at this stuff, and we're yet to discuss his other 2 outings. I don't think they're as strong as the Macra Terror Mind, but they're still incredibly respectable efforts. The War Machines focuses on the unnerving premise that machines and technology could eventually rise above their creators and enslave mankind, a fear very prevalent in the minds of viewers and creatives alike in the 60s, and exemplified in the story's villain, the mind-controlling supercomputer Wotan. The story concept itself was apparently originally suggested by Kit Pedler, which, considering he would soon become co-creator of the Cybermen, who were pretty much the embodiment of the technophobic fears of the time, makes a ton of sense. Still, Ian Stuart Black was the man appointed to fully flesh out the idea into the completed script form, and he does so very effectively. It's worth noting that this is also one of surprisingly few outings in the First Doctor era, or even the 60s as a whole, to be set in the contemporary present-day Earth of the time of broadcast, and I think that creative decision is genius for this kind of premise. Not to say that this idea wouldn't be effective if it was set anywhere or anywhen else, but it's certainly a brave and compelling move to set a tale based around a widespread public fear within the familiar comfort zone of the audience. The Savages, meanwhile, arguably has the weakest and most tenuous link to the idea of psychological horror, but it's still competent nonetheless. Like the Macra Terror, it's centered around an eerily idealistic society who welcome the Doctor and friends with open arms, while masking a dark secret based on exploitation. Except in this case, it's the society itself doing the exploitation, draining the life force and vitality of outcast savages for their own personal gain. And when the Doctor inevitably stands up to them, he himself becomes victim to this horrific process. It's a creepy idea, but it does feel a bit like a progenitor for Black's later and stronger stories. The other common trend in Ian Stuart Black's scripts is the surprisingly prominent character drama, or at least character events, for the companions present, and he seems to know how to write for them effectively, in some cases giving them their best material. The Savages is notable for being the departure story for Stephen, and it's a pretty strange one for him, as he seems oddly naive and dismissive of any sinister goings-on at some points, which comes across as a bit out of character for him. But otherwise he does the typical 60s action hero companion shtick pretty serviceably, and the departure itself fits well enough, I guess, even if it does come a bit out of nowhere. Something else notable about Ian Stuart Black's companion writing is that he's the one and only writer to make Dodo even somewhat tolerable. Seriously, in The Savages she's actually surprisingly investigative when Stephen isn't, and she's finally figured out when to shut her goddamn mouth, which comes as a huge welcome relief. And this improvement for her character carries over to the War Machines, where she hits the nightclub, gets hypnotized, and leaves the show off screen. Oh. Well, it's a humorously lacking departure for an annoyingly lacking character, so I can't get too mad at it. Besides, the War Machines prioritises the introduction of new companions Able Seaman Ben Jackson and Secretary Polly anyway, both refreshingly naturalistic breaths of fresh air to the main cast, who emanate that swinging 60s vibe through his Cockney charm and her streetwise glamour respectively. I dare say their debut is the adventure which characterises the pair of them the strongest, and their chemistry with each other and the Doctor is incredibly endearing. Finally, the Macra Terror is notable for being the story where Jamie McCrimmon arguably finally comes into his own. You see, for his first 3 stories, Jamie was kind of treated as this inessential, borderline disposable background extra who mostly just tagged along with Ben and didn't really contribute much. However, with Ben's own brainwashing and torn loyalty subplot in this adventure, which in itself is some highly compelling character work, Jamie gets to go off on his own down the old shaft with the Macra, and it's great to see his independence begin to flourish. And he also gets some great moments of endearing comedy. The Highland Fling, anyone? Polly unfortunately takes the back burner in this tale though, but 2 out of 3 isn't too shabby. Let's also analyse how these stories utilise the Doctor. Now, due to William Hartnell's deteriorating health, the First Doctor's presence in his later stories was greatly diminished to compensate, with a lot of his material getting pawned off to his companions, and both the Savages and the War Machines are subject to this. He's not particularly active in either, being subjected to a brutal energy drain that leaves him catatonic in one, and kinda just hanging around in the same room for most of the other. But he still gets a moment in each where he courageously stands up to the threat, so there's something. Meanwhile, the Macra Terror continues the trend of perfecting the Second Doctor's personality, really emphasising his defiant rebellious streak at many points, like with the beloved rough and tumble scene. And this scenario really lets his sneaky infiltrative side shine through as he tries to balance finding out about the Macra from Medoc with staying on the good side of the pilot and the colony as a whole. Wonderfully endearing character moments for days too, especially that scene where he's figuring out and writing down the calculations and gives himself a 10 out of 10. I love him. And as for my final talking point, villains. The Macra are propaganda-spreading giant crabs, desperate to hide their identities so that they can maintain their parasitic dystopian police state, who perfectly walk the fine line between sinister menace and goofy hilarity. Even the voice which they put on for their controller identity, the dignified authoritarian comfort that it is at face value, is particularly unnerving. The titular war machines themselves have a similar appeal to them. They're humorously bulky and impractical looking, but they prove their force pretty effectively during their invasion of London. And Wotan's voice and mind control powers supply us with a number of chilling moments. Let's not forget how he breaks the fourth wall on a couple of occasions. Finally, the Elders are a pretty effective representation of class warfare in how callously they round up the Savages and drain them for their own personal gain. Jano in particular is an interesting case where the villain defects to the side of good, when he inadvertently absorbs aspects of the Doctor's personality and conscience as part of an energy transfusion, which is a particularly amusing and fascinating process to watch play out. So Ian Stuart Black seems to be a pretty strong writer for Doctor Who as far as I'm concerned. So, what's the fans' general consensus on his output? It disappoints me to say that Ian Stuart Black seems to have a pretty middling reputation among the general fandom. Delving into the 2014 Doctor Who magazine poll, all 3 of his scripts resided in the triple digits, with the Savages being the lowest and just barely keeping its head above the number 200, the War Machines peaking the highest of the 3 at number 133, and the Macra Terror shockingly securing itself at the 150th spot. I myself would definitely be much kinder to all three of them. Though in all fairness, their placement in that poll may have been heavily affected by their current archival state. Yeah, unfortunately, Ian Stuart Black is another writer whose output has been heavily affected by the BBC's archival junking practices. 2 of his 3 stories have been affected by these purges, with only the War Machine still standing almost totally unaffected by this brutality. The Savages is unfortunately nowhere near as lucky, as all 4 episodes of the serial are lost, with only the full audio and a handful of poor quality clips surviving. The Macra Terror is in much the same state. No surviving episodes, just the soundtrack and a couple of clips. However, in the latter's case, it must be noted that it has received significant renewed interest ever since the incredible animated recreation released in 2019, and so it's almost certain that its popularity has soared much higher in recent years. But still, the fact that 2 of Black's 3 stories no longer fully survive in their original format may be a significant contribution to his obscurity in the eyes of fandom, especially when some fans are daunted by the idea of listening to just the surviving soundtracks alone or watching the missing episode animations. And honestly, I think he deserves way better. This guy knew his stuff. His creative, psychologically unnerving stuff. Even if his character work could be hit or miss. Who knows, maybe he'll become the second coming of Christ if we get a Savages animation.